Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep, into a side of the Cold War that might surprise you.
Yeah, when you hear Cold War, you probably think of, well, missiles and spies.
Right, exactly, like the Cuban Missile Crisis or something.
But this is different. We're diving into the world of art and music and books, even Hollywood.
It's the Cold War, but fought with culture as the weapon. And our guide for this deep dive is Frances Stoner Saunders' book, Who Paid the Piper?
It's all about the CIA and the Cultural Cold War. A really deep dive into how these things, art and culture, became like a battleground.
It's fascinating because it wasn't just about making propaganda. It was way more subtle than that.
Right. It was about trying to change the way people all over the world saw America and the Soviet Union.
Shaping how they thought about each side.
Exactly, like influencing, I don't know, like the very fabric of how people saw the world after World War II.
So, to understand how all this started, we need to picture the world right after the war. Europe is in ruins.
Total devastation.
And there's this huge tension between the US and the Soviet Union. Two superpowers with completely different ways of thinking, competing for power.
And here's the thing. The Soviets were really good at using culture to their advantage. They figured out early on that winning over people's minds was just as important as military power.
Because they knew they couldn't really compete with the US in terms of, money and nukes.
Yeah, right. Economically and militarily, they were behind. So they focused on what we now call soft power.
Using culture to build influence. It's really interesting. Saunders quotes this intelligence officer from way back in 1945.
Oh, yeah.
He said, "The invention of the atomic bomb will cause a shift. We must expect a very marked increase in the importance of peaceful methods."
Wow. Talk about predicting the future.
Right. He
Yeah.
saw it coming. And the Soviets put those peaceful methods into action. For example, they set up these America Housers all across Germany.
America House.
Basically, they were cultural centers, kind of designed to counter American stereotypes.
Like, they were trying to show a Soviet-approved version of American life.
Exactly. They had libraries, showed films, even hosted jazz concerts.
Wait, jazz concerts? Isn't jazz like the symbol of American freedom? Why would the Soviets promote that?
Well, that's the clever part. They weren't showcasing jazz in its purest form. They were picking and choosing elements that fit their narrative.
So it was more about controlling the message than actually celebrating jazz.
Exactly. They were presenting this carefully curated version of American culture, one that served their interests. And while all this was happening, the U.S. realized they couldn't just sit back and watch.
They had to get in the game, too.
Right, they needed their own strategies for this cultural war. And that's where guys like Michael Josselson and Nicholas Nabokov come in.
There were big players in the early days working to rebuild the cultural scene in Germany, trying to counter that Soviet influence.
One of their tactics was pretty interesting. They tried to bring back artists who had been, let's say, associated with the Nazi regime.
Oh, wow. So they were willing to work with some controversial figures.
Saunders specifically mentions Wilhelm Furtwängler, a famous conductor.
Right.
He was accused of collaborating with the Nazis, but they saw him as valuable.
So bringing him back was a way to push back against the Soviets, but it must have been a really risky move.
It definitely was. And it raises some really tough questions about the ethics of the cultural Cold War.
Right, because it wasn't just a simple fight between good and evil. Both sides were willing to do some morally questionable things.
It shows how high the stakes were. They were playing for keeps. And this brings us to the big player in all of this, the CIA. Saunders really gets into how they got involved in these cultural operations.
Right, the CIA wasn't just about spies and secret missions.
No, not at all. Saunders describes the atmosphere at CIA headquarters as, a mix of urgency and idealism. Think, temporary buildings, tons of meetings.
A lot of young, ambitious people, many fresh out of those fancy Ivy League schools.
And they all believed they were on the front lines of this fight against communism.
Like an army of intellectuals, almost. And one of their main weapons was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, or the CCF.
This was the brainchild of Arthur Koestler.
Koestler, wasn't he a writer?
Yeah, and he actually used to be a member of the Communist Party.
Oh, wow. So he knew the system from the inside.
Exactly. But he became disillusioned with Stalinism and wanted to create an organization that would champion freedom of expression and democratic values through the arts.
So the CCF was promoting all these good things, but here's the twist.
It was secretly funded by the CIA.
Wait, what? Secretly? Sounds like something out of a spy movie. Like all this hidden money and secret agendas makes you wonder what else was going on.
And that's exactly what Saunders digs into in her book. She shows how the CIA used all these private foundations and wealthy individuals to funnel money to the CCF.
So they were supporting these cultural activities, but they didn't want anyone to know they were involved.
It was all very hush-hush. One of their first big operations was called Operation Congress. Kitschy, right?
Operation Congress? Sounds serious. What was that all about?
Well, it was the code name for the CIA's covert support of the CCF, which ended up setting up its headquarters in Paris.
Paris, of
Yeah.
course. The center of the art world at the time.
A very strategic choice. But the question is, where did all the money for this come from?
Yeah, they must have needed a lot of it to run an operation like that.
Well, Saunders discovered that some of it was actually siphoned off from the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan, the program to help rebuild Europe after the war.
That's the one.
So they were using money meant for rebuilding Europe to fund a secret cultural war. That's pretty bold.
It shows you how interconnected everything was during the Cold War. It wasn't just about rebuilding economies or building weapons. It was about winning hearts and minds. And sometimes those strategies got mixed up in ways you wouldn't expect.
Like taking money from one program to fund another.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting. Saunders tells this story about Diana Dodge, who later married Michael Josselson. She went to visit him in his hotel room and found him hiding in the bathroom.
Hiding in the bathroom? What was going on?
Turns out he was having a secret meeting with Irving Brown, a key player in the CIA's labor operations.
Wow. That little detail says a lot about how secretive this whole operation was.
It was a world of hidden agendas and secret meetings. And it all leads to the question, how did they actually use this cultural weapon? What did this cultural war really look like?
Yeah, let's get into the specifics. How did they actually put this all into action? So we've been talking about how the CIA got deeply involved in shaping American culture during the Cold War. But, well, it couldn't stay secret forever, could it?
Right, like trying to keep a secret war with culture, it's going to come out eventually. Saunders shows us how those cracks in the CIA's facade started to show, and what happened when it all started to fall apart. It's like, imagine this perfectly built stage set, and then it starts to wobble.
Yeah, and one of those first big wobbles was the Hungarian uprising back in 1956. It was this huge revolt against Soviet rule. But then, well, the Red Army came in and crushed it. You can imagine what that did to the people involved in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Their whole idea was promoting freedom and democracy, and then this happens.
It must have felt like, I don't know, a total contradiction. All those big ideas about freedom clashing with this brutal reality. So did it change the CCF's mission at all?
It definitely brought up some uncomfortable questions. And it wasn't just Hungary. Critics within the CCF, people like Dwight MacDonald, they started speaking out more and more.
Dwight MacDonald.
Yeah, he was this really smart but kind of controversial journalist. He'd been with the CCF from the start, but he was really passionate about freedom of expression, and he started having doubts, big doubts about the organization's ties to the CIA.
So he's part of this group that's supposed to be all about freedom, but then it turns out they're getting money from a spy agency, famous for, well, being secretive.
Yeah, exactly. MacDonald wasn't afraid to talk about it either. He wrote this really strong critique of American culture and foreign policy.
Yeah.
Called it America. America. And guess where he published it?
I don't know, some underground magazine.
Nope, right in Encounter,
Hmm.
the CCF's own magazine. It was a big risk. It really showed the tension that was brewing inside the organization. MacDonald basically argued that America was getting obsessed with money and the military, and that this whole thing about fighting communism was leading them down a bad path.
Wow, talk about biting the hand that feeds you. I'm surprised the CIA let them publish it.
Well, according to Saunders, they did let it get published, but not without a lot of edits. They probably figured that trying to silence MacDonald would just make them look worse, but it showed they were losing control of the story.
So they had these internal critics like MacDonald calling them out, and then there was this whole thing about McCarthyism, kind of a contradiction for an organization that says they're all about free speech.
Oh yeah, a total blind spot. Remember McCarthyism? That whole period in America with all the paranoia about communists, people were getting accused without any real proof. The CCF not speaking out against it really showed that they cared more about keeping up appearances and getting that CIA money than they did about their own supposed principles.
So you've got MacDonald pointing out hypocrisy, this weird silence on McCarthyism, and it seems like the whole thing is about to crumble.
And then boom, the truth comes out. Everyone finds out the CIA was funding the CCF all along. That was the final blow. Totally destroyed the facade.
I bet that caused chaos. So how did the truth come out?
Well, it was Tom Braden. He was a former CIA guy who had helped set up the CCF, and he decided to spill the beans,
Just came out and said it.
pretty much. He wrote this article in the Saturday Evening Post, I think it was 1967, just admitted the CIA was funding the CCF. His argument was, well, the Soviets were using culture as a weapon, so America had to fight back, even if it meant doing some shady stuff.
So he basically confirmed what everyone was already suspecting.
It was huge uproar. The CIA had to admit they were involved, and the CCF, well, they were pretty much done. It was a bad moment for the CIA. It made them rethink all their covert operations.
And then there was the Katzenbach report, right?
Yeah, President Johnson asked for a report on all of this. The conclusion was, well, using private groups for covert stuff might have been okay in the early Cold War days, but not anymore.
So basically, a big wake-up call for the CIA. But even though the CCF was gone, and the CIA had to scale back their direct involvement in cultural things, the whole cultural Cold War, I mean, that didn't just disappear, right?
Absolutely not. Finding out the CIA had been meddling in the arts really damaged the credibility of those American cultural institutions.
It's like if you're an artist and you find out your work was secretly being promoted by spies. I mean, it would make you question everything.
Totally. It created this feeling of like suspicion and mistrust. People started wondering, was any of it real? Were these cultural achievements actually genuine, or were they just part of some Cold War scheme?
Yeah. So this wasn't just about individual artists. It was about the whole relationship between the government and the art world.
For sure. Because it set a bad example. Once you know the government's been secretly messing around with the arts, it's hard to trust anything as being truly independent or real. That kind of damage takes a long time to heal.
It's like even if their goal was to promote American culture, the way they did it ended up backfiring.
And then there were the ethical problems. Using fake organizations, secret money, even putting agents undercover within these cultural groups, it just raises questions about freedom of expression and artistic integrity.
It's like they were using art as a tool, a pawn in this bigger political game.
Exactly. Blurring the lines between genuine cultural exchange and, just straight up manipulation. It left people feeling betrayed and I think a little disillusioned.
Okay, so we've seen how the CIA's role got exposed, but I'm really curious about the specific ways they used culture. How did they actually do it?
Well, that's where it gets really fascinating. Saunders dives into how the CIA used music, especially jazz.
Jazz. That seems kind of unexpected. I mean, when you think about jazz, you think of freedom, creativity, not exactly what comes to mind with the CIA.
That's why it was so effective, right? Yeah. Jazz had this image, like it was seen as this purely American art form, like born in the USA.
So the CIA saw an opportunity there.
Yeah, they thought, let's use this. We can promote American culture and values through jazz. They started sponsoring these huge jazz tours, sending musicians like Dizzy Gillespie and Louis Armstrong all around the world.
So these musicians became like cultural ambassadors almost.
Exactly. It was a much smarter way to do propaganda, way more subtle than just, dropping leaflets or making radio broadcasts.
People love music. They go to a concert, they have a good time, and they maybe subconsciously start to associate those good feelings with America.
Yeah, it definitely helps soften America's image, especially in places that might have been a little skeptical.
So it all sounds pretty good so far. But I'm guessing there's more to the story.
Yeah, there was let's just say a more complicated side to all this.
Complicated how?
Well, sometimes it was hard to tell where the cultural diplomacy ended and the spying began. Saunders found out that the CIA was also using these jazz musicians to gather intelligence.
They're using the musicians as spies.
It's not that clear-cut. Some of them knew about it and were okay with it. Others had no idea they were being used. It's one of those murky areas where it's hard to know the full story.
It makes you wonder, right? Like, were these cultural exchanges actually about sharing music, or were they just a cover for something else, something less innocent?
I think it was probably a mix of both. It's never that simple. And jazz wasn't the only genre they were interested in. They also saw the potential of classical music.
Classical music, that seems a little, a little highbrow for a propaganda campaign.
Well, think about it. Classical music has this image, right? It's sophisticated, elegant. The CIA saw it as a way to counter that Soviet narrative that America was just a cultural wasteland.
Okay, yeah, I see.
Saunders talks about the Boston Symphony Orchestra's tour of Europe in 1952. It was a big deal.
Sending one of America's top orchestras to Europe. What's the CIA angle here?
It was a chance to showcase American talent, show that the U.S. had a rich cultural tradition. They thought it could help dispel that idea that America was all about materialism.
I mean, who's going to accuse an orchestra of being a weapon of propaganda? Yeah.
Exactly. But at the same time, the CIA was using the tour to gather intelligence. They had agents planted among the orchestra staff.
No way. So there were actual spies embedded within the orchestra.
It's like a scene straight out of a Cold War spy movie. They used the musicians' travels to gather information about what was happening in Europe.
Wow. So we've got music, we've got spies, and it doesn't stop there. Saunders talks about how the CIA was also involved in the world of publishing.
They were big into that, using these front organizations and secretly funding the publication of books that pushed their Cold War agenda.
Like a secret CIA publishing empire. What kind of books were they promoting?
Well, one of the most famous examples is George Orwell's Animal Farm.
Animal Farm, that's a classic.
It's a satire about totalitarianism, so it was seen as this perfect weapon against the Soviet Union. And they didn't just help publish it, they also secretly funded an animated film version in the 1950s.
Wow, so they went beyond just books. They were using film, too.
Yeah, they wanted to get that message out to as many people as possible, especially behind the Iron Curtain.
So they were using all these different forms of culture, music, literature, film to spread their message.
They were pulling strings everywhere. And of course, eventually the truth came out and all that covert activity unraveled.
Right, and we talked about all that fallout. But what was the impact, the long-term impact of all this?
It's a tough question. Saunders really tries to wrestle with that throughout the book. It's not a simple answer.
Because on one hand, they did succeed in spreading American culture. More people around the world were exposed to jazz, to American art, to American literature.
But then there's the other side of the coin.
The dark side.
When people found out about the CIA's involvement, it really hurt the credibility of American cultural institutions.
Imagine you're an artist, and you find out your work was secretly promoted by, well, by skies.
It would make you question your whole career.
Yeah, like, was any of it real? Was it really my talent? Or was it just the CIA? It created a whole atmosphere of suspicion.
And that suspicion lasted a long time. This wasn't just about individual artists either. It really changed the relationship between the government and the whole cultural world.
It kind of broke the trust.
Yeah, because it set this precedent, right? If the government was secretly messing around in the arts during the Cold War, who's to say they're not still doing it today?
It's a valid question. And it's hard to get that trust back once it's gone. So I guess the big takeaway here is that even if the CIA was successful in promoting American culture, the way they went about it caused more harm than good.
Exactly. It all comes back to ethics. Using those front organizations, covert funding, putting agents undercover, it just raises all these red flags about freedom of expression and artistic integrity.
It's like they forgot that art is supposed to be about something more than just politics. It's about human expression, about creativity.
Yeah, and by treating it like a weapon, I think they really undermine the whole point of what they were trying to do.
So what have we learned from this deep dive into the CIA and the cultural Cold War? What are the big takeaways?
I think the biggest one is that culture is never neutral. It's always tied up with power and politics. And during the Cold War, those forces were everywhere.
Right, and the U.S. and the Soviet Union both understood that. They knew that winning over people's minds was crucial in that battle for global dominance.
They saw culture as a key battleground. And the CIA played a big part in that, even though it was controversial. What they did raises all sorts of questions about the role of government in shaping public opinion and whether it's ever okay to use culture as a weapon.
And I love that line Saunders uses at the end of her book. The history of the cultural Cold War is a reminder that the battle for ideas is never truly over.
That's so true. And it feels even more relevant now, you know? We face new threats to democracy and free speech all the time.
The battleground might have changed. It's not just art galleries and concert halls anymore. It's more like the internet and social media. But the basic idea is the same.
Absolutely. The tactics might be different, but the goal is the same. To shape the way people think, to influence them, to win them over. And we need to be aware of that. We need to be critical thinkers, to question where our information comes from, and to understand how culture can be used to manipulate us.
It's a challenge, for sure.
But knowing about the cultural Cold War, understanding how it worked, it can give us some tools to resist manipulation and make better choices.
Well said. So as you go about your day, think about the messages you're receiving, the stories you're being told, who's behind them, what are their motivations, and how are they using culture to influence you? It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it's a constant process, but I think it's an important one.
I agree. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a really fascinating and often overlooked part of history. It's a story with twists and turns and some really important lessons for today.